If I may assert, I think I have the solution for that. It'll take me 30 seconds to say.
Please.
I believe there needs to be a Hippocratic oath for science as a whole and not just for medicine, especially if we're talking about being able to precipitate infinite energy, because absolute power, corrupts absolutely. So we have to first say there are certain uses for this infinite energy which we as human beings prohibit from day one. Please go ahead with Roland's input on this.
Yeah, thank you guys. I would definitely want to echo what both the Andrews are saying. The mission statement that we have for Global Emergent Technologies is the 6 fundamental things that in my lifetime, my goal is to have those 6 things, energy, food, water, healing, shelter, and waste solutions be 100% free for every single human on the entire planet forever. And that's something that we should, as a human race, we should definitely have the ability. We have the technical ability to do that. There's no reason we can't do it with the energy solutions we have now. And so now, how do we get there is the question. Right now we live in a society that is where our primary exchange of value is through the representation of money. And so, you know, when I've got into this, trying to figure out how to get these technologies into people's hands, we've worked with some open source technologies and you know, with the vortex resonance coils, and there's some very interesting research that needs to continue down that line. Those technologies weren't as ready as others, but they absolutely have real applications in energy. And there's more on that, and that's an open source technology that anybody can build. Daniel Nunez open sourced that and released it. But then there's other people who have technologies and they've put, you know, their life into building a technology and inventing it, and they, you know, working with these technologies, they need to get a payback in order for them to survive in today's world. And so there's a balance there that I believe that right now we're at a very interesting transition point where these technologies do exist. You know, the way that we've structured companies is to receive investment in the normal way that companies do. You need to protect the intellectual property, patent it, and do other strategies to protect that, form a corporation, a traditional corporation, and that is how investors can protect themselves, by investing into something to get an ROI. It's the basic business 101. And that's where we're at today. It's not the ideal situation for something as valuable as fire or air, which this is just that valuable, if not more. You know, the first fire, nobody patented that, and that's obviously gotten us quite far. And so it's on that level of paradigm-shifting technologies, and I believe as the infrastructure is built over the next 10 to 20 years, eventually technologies like this will be able to, because once the wars stop being fought over limited, scarce resources like oil and other things, once abundance is so clear from this, the value of paying for those things will be so cheap. The infrastructure will be built, and then I think we're going to head towards the Jetsons era, or the Star Wars or Star Trek era. So, so that's my thoughts on that.
All right, thank you. Really, for Roland and Andrew Murray, what do you guys see? And because you get to play with devices, you get to play with things, you get to visit people, you get to even build your own in a variety of different ways, right? So I want to know what gets you guys excited. So, you know, kind of like, as we look at, really, when you wake up in the morning and you get excited about what you're doing, what you see, because, you know, there's so many different variations, right? So what is it that excites both of you, and what do you see as really being something that's most promising right now? What excites you?
Roland, if you'd like to take it away, actually, I'd be interested to, as we've talked about before with your history of being from Alaska and how your journey's progressed, I'd love to,
yes.
I always love hearing that story over and over again, so if you'd please,
sure.
The stage is yours.
Yeah, sure, yeah. So what the first company I started was called Native Clean Energy. I'm actually part of the Yakutat Tlingit tribe in Yakutat, Alaska. The reason I actually got into doing research and development in this field is because I'm from an area where there's about 800 people year-round, and it's a fishing community in southeast Alaska, Yakutat. And right now, electricity costs 53 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's because the whole town is run off of a 1 megawatt diesel-powered generator. And so the diesel fuel makes the cost really high. And so that's really what got me about 7-8 years ago into looking for a solution. And then when I started looking for a solution and I realized that there was many technologies that did not get the attention they deserved, and for some reason or another didn't make it into places like Yakutat that really needs it, I said, well, I'm going to do something about it. So I literally quit my very successful corporate career in corporate marketing. I used to manage all of General Motors' online ad spend for North America for all 8 brands way back in 2007, 2008. And I quit that career to literally dive into doing what I could do to help move this new energy movement to a place where we can use it. Now, to your question, Susan, about what gets me up in the morning and what gets me excited about what I'm working on, it's, you know, the solid state new crystal cells that Marcus Reed is making in our sister lab in Munich, Germany, really are quite amazing. His version 1.0 is only 15 milliwatts per kilogram power density. So it can, a small cell as big as 2D batteries can light up a few LEDs. And that's not a lot of power. But the fact is that's been running since 1999, and it still is putting out the same amount of power. And so that's really exciting to know that, like what Andrew Murray mentioned about the Casimir effect, which is when you put 2 plates together, there's a push from the atmosphere. And that is actually taking place in that mechanism in these cells. Now 2.0, we are working on, we actually have had a custom-built nano-engineering machine where we can lay down materials at less than 1 nanometer. And therefore, with our knowledge that we've gained the last few years with materials, we're getting some very interesting results. And we believe that in the next few months, we should have some prototypes coming out that will really increase the power density versus 1.0. So that's the crystal cell, and you're looking at the screen right now at a book that we're about ready to release called Virtual Particles and Electromagnetism, which explains the mechanisms and physics behind what the experimental results that we're seeing. It's what roles do virtual particles and broken symmetries play in common electrical systems, and the other thing that gets me excited is the jewel box, because I've spent the last, and I'll kind of skip down to here, I've spent the last 6 to 8 months educating the Alaskan leaders about this technology as a way to lower the cost of living in these very remote, highly costly towns in Alaska. There's over 100 individual power grids in Alaska that run off of about 1 megawatt of diesel power. In some places that they actually pay upwards over $1 a kilowatt hour, which really makes it expensive to live there. When you have milk that costs $8 a gallon, everything is more expensive in these remote places. And that's where I grew up. And that's where I want these generators to go first, in these places that it can make the most difference immediately. And so we're looking at delivering one of these within about 2 months from now up to Alaska and a few other places as well. So this is real technology. It's available now. It can be touch it and feel it and measure it. And the fact that exists, that's what really makes me excited, Susan. So,
Thank you. Andrew.
Thank you, Roland. It's always great hearing that story, man. I love it.
Yeah.
So for me, it's what gets me up in the morning, I would say, is another moment to experience and interact with nature, as nature is the main teacher in what we are all, and with these technologies, everything that we are developing is modeled off something in nature. At least if one is to build one of these devices that is actually operational and does not destroy itself in a short period of time, which there have been people who have got COP greater than 1 or a coefficient of performance greater than 1, but the device has consumed itself, or more or less exploded and caused some detrimental effects to the device itself. So for me, what gets me up in the morning is knowing that I'm going to wake up, I'm going to take some deep breaths, and to know that the air I'm breathing is the air that I'm sharing with everybody across the planet, and that the air that I'm exhaling, if I breathe that out, another human being cannot inhale that without being poisoned. So it has to go through nature to become filtered, so the CO2 turns to O2 again. So it's always good to know it's always a natural process, everything we do, whether it's philosophy or physics or any discipline, really. So for me, it's knowing that when I wake up, I get to go to a lab and to interact with other people, and to be on this panel here and to see how these synchronicities just continue to roll out day by day, in a sense that it's never something new each day, and that makes me very excited. And I must say, I've been researching this for extended period of time, quote unquote, whatever that may mean, and to be able to actually understand at least a couple of the principles and understand that I know nothing still, but still understand that there are some original questions in physics and quantum mechanics, and let's say what dark matter and dark energy is, and it's still a big question mark in quantum gravity, and now be able to point to at least some answers to those of some grand unified field theories and other field theorists who actually have found, using various quaternion mathematics or various pretty much complicated math and theories, and proving them in actual devices, that these theories that were postulated, I think a very, very long time ago, I was saying with the Pythagoras and the more or less neo-ether concepts, that it is now being proven that the vacuum does have a geometric formation, a crystalline lattice structure that is dynamic. And that alone, it makes me excited every day to know that finally we can start to see that the vacuum itself has a coherent structure, and that everything cannot exist without there being coherent structure already existing in the vacuum. So that makes me very happy, and every single moment just to be on the stage interacting more and more, and how even coming to this panel, right, and how we all came together, and the ways we helped each other to get here, that makes me happy. And you see friends in the audience makes me happy, and it's just gotta continuously, it's just gonna keep growing like this. So it's it's an exponential function.
Because this is different. Just to share with some of you folks, this is different because typically most people that talk about new energy technology are up there advocating one thing or another. This is actually one of the first times that it's small, and it's a small room, but we're making a mark in the field today by doing something different, in the sense that we've all collaborated in advance. Some people knew each other and some people didn't. And this was actually a team that came together to talk about how we wanted to show up today, in what manner. Because one of the things about this field, if you've been in it for a while or know something about it, is, like I said, it's been like the Wild West. And some of the quotes on here that I have is, "I've got the big one, I've done it, I've discovered it. Nobody else can figure this out. It's me, me, me. If I had $1 million, it would be done. If I had $20 million, it would be done." And so these are some of the types of things that we hear, and you have to ask yourself, well, wait a second. Well, you've got the 20 million, you have the 1 million. You aren't the one that has the whole answer. So what needs to change in this field? What is it that needs to shift? And why aren't there more women in this field? Really heavily dominated by, male energy. And if we're talking about extracting energy from the vacuum of space, which is nature, it's the yin and the yang. Am I not wrong on that?
That's actually why I stepped out of technology development in the new energy field, is because I could see that there was a tremendous amount of hype, and the messianic sort of fervor that certain innovators, inventors would adopt. Got to go after that funding to prove my next advance in this field, whereas they themselves were not even 100% certain that they could materialize the result, and yet were hyping investors to back them. I didn't want to become one of those people because I have my own ideas about how to propagate this technology since I studied for 9 years at the feet of a bona fide genius in this area. But the last thing I want to do is say, I can do it like the Sorcerer's Apprentice and try to cast the spell on somebody that they ought to back me to be the guy, because I just definitely did not want to fall into that trap. So I instead adopted the posture of an organic farmer because I could get into a lot less trouble that way, and also perhaps learn some of the same underlying principles or be exposed to some of the same quantum forces that I would need to be familiar with in order to be a good inventor. So yeah, I just basically have the attitude that we're not actually going to see the big one until there's a more Aquarian approach to the development of these technologies where collaboration is key. I've been proposing something like a public domain Manhattan project for new energy, where all the best thinkers and all of the best stewards of nature and the human heart come together and say, this is actually not just a technical movement, this is a spiritual imperative for our civilization to continue. Therefore, it shouldn't be privatized, and all the results should be given to the most highly leveraged social relief organizations to make sure that communities such as the native communities and others who have been impacted negatively by fossil fuel development or what have you receive the benefits. First and foremost, bioremediation, planetary renewal. These are the sorts of ethics that I believe ought to accompany the advent of new energy.
Excellent. One of the things I want to ask the panel, and we're going to go on to that as well, but one of the things I want to ask the panel is, what's your thoughts on back engineering? What's your thoughts on, if people know of Roswell, talk about back engineering of devices. If you've seen some of Bob Lazar's videos and work, they're quite interesting. And it's one of the topics that's going on. I get emails back and forth saying either help or do you know anything about this, where some inventors have gotten their devices taken from them and there's a lab that's all set up, ready to go, that's back engineering that device and creating some type of outputs that are different than what the original inventor had intended, yet it's happening. So I want to know, the panel's, what is your thoughts on that? Because there's this sense of running to the device, but how it's done, and is this something that actually is a good thing or not a good thing? So I'm curious to everybody's response on that, because I think really today, we can put a mark in the field of being able to talk about what are the ethics that are involved in some of these things.
If I may then, yeah, it's a very, very important question to bring up of the difference between we want to open source this technology, meaning that when one person creates something, to give it openly, freely to the public domain, meaning that you say whatever your material list, exactly where you bought it, exactly how to build it, basically an IKEA list of how to build these technologies. And some of the issues, like you're saying with the back engineering, is that certain people, well, everybody has their different perspectives and methodologies of how to build something. No one person will build the exact same unit the exact same way. And in that, there is a step process that is required in some of these devices. And what I mean by this is that I have people who I work with who have built devices that show these anomalous effects, yet they have caused some detrimental effects in the local environment that took a number of days to actually get back to a restored or normalized state. And so if one person then is to, let's say, build that device, and then someone else is to reverse engineer that without knowing or having the right tools to measure what those blemishes or more or less distortions in the local environment were, someone can continuously damage their biological system as well as the local environment without even knowing it. So there's this there's this factor that we have to have in us of knowing that we don't know anything. And that could be a very difficult thing for, I mean, anybody, and especially a physicist who spent 8 years or more getting their PhD, or more or less, not to offend anybody, but permanent head damage and a factor of, these are the equations, and you have to take these things as fact. And with that brings a certain level of arrogance, quite honestly, that we're not trying to combat that, but we're trying to work with that and trying to show that what has been taught to us is we need to relearn, in some cases unlearn, a lot of the things that have been taught. So with this thing of the ethics of back engineering, it's very important that if one is to, let's say, reverse engineer one of these technologies, go directly to the source. Don't try to hide it. Talk to the person who came up with the technology. Try to get a hold of that person. Even if it's difficult to, go after that person. And don't just go after it with, let's say, whimsical concepts. Do your homework on it, you know, look up the person, come up with your own questions, create a PowerPoint presentation, make it so that even if you can't get an audience with the person, you can hand a one-page document to the person with a list of bullet points that state, here's what I think your technology is, here's what I want to utilize it for, and do you think it can work in this way? And it's always better to have communication in these fields, otherwise you can actually do, like I was saying, detrimental effects. And like I'm saying, these things do occur quite a lot, and yeah, it's important.
It's like kids playing with the cosmic matchsticks or something like that?
Very much so, yeah, very much.
New Energy Movement, the organization that Susan and I both represent here, I guess, today, is an advocacy group founded specifically to represent, well, one of its key missions is specifically to represent the interests of those seeking to advance exotic energy technologies. Because one of the biggest problems with pioneers in this field is that they do feel very much alone. They develop strange behavioral characteristics that can make it almost impossible to work with them due to their sense of isolation. And if they had an advocate, a friend, who said, you know, we want to make sure you get the best investor, the best marketing plan, the best allies, technical support, feedback, then suddenly they're not so alone anymore. And this is my way of addressing the question of reverse engineering technologies, which I'm not familiar with as a practice in this field, but it's my way of addressing that is, let's not allow this decades-long pattern to continue. Let us get on the side of the people who are trying to liberate us from the fossil fuel nightmare. Let us find out who they are and say, how can I help you? Now, one of the best ways to do that is contact New Energy Movement, and we can tell you who some of these people are, if they're near you or if they're in a particular field that you have an interest in learning more about. You know, we can...
And they're usually the least popular, not the most. Typically.
You might find that those people might even appreciate a can of soup as opposed to, you know, a collaborative physicist, because I lived for 9 years with one of these innovators, and I'll tell you, it was hand to mouth almost 24/7, 365, because this is unconventional. It's not supported by the establishment. There aren't grants for new energy technology. Just one last point. New Energy Movement actually went to Washington with a bill that we wrote specifically to fund new energy technologies. And it never made it to the Senate floor because they said, well, we can't just fund exotic technologies only. We've got to also fund the more, you know, conventional alternatives. And this is precisely the problem, is nobody is willing to step up fully for those pioneers who are out there on the fringe. Instead, they're just called fringe. And, oh, well, that's just fringe. But they're not just fringe. These are the people who actually may have the holy grail of science at their fingertips. So at any rate, if you believe in that myth, it's a worthy one to get behind, because we are at the end of the fossil fuel era right now.
Thank you. So there's one last question for the panel, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers from all of you. So regarding the public at large, because I think this is a really great segue, what is their responsibility? What is it? How do we see this work come to light? Because if we know that there's issues with funding, if we know that the isolation on behalf of the inventors, we know that kids being taught in school, they're not being taught current science at this point, right? So you've got a whole other generation in terms of public schooling that is not being taught, you know, some of these fundamental things that these scientists and inventors are discovering that could really usher in this new age to be able to liberate us as people and on a planet. So what is the responsibility? What can people do? Roland, do you want to?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, Roland, how about you try to answer that first?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's, for example, in some of the technologies we're working with, you know, people in the audience and who will watch this video in the future, you know, there's a need for many types of talents in this industry, and so to back up to kind of tie in the last question to this question, you know, about back engineering and whatnot. I realized when I had my own lab and I was building my own crystal cells and my own vortex coils and doing my own experiments and getting some pretty interesting effects, I realized that I wasn't the best chemist and I wasn't the best electrical engineer. But I realized what my skill set was communication and relationship management, and in being able to translate the really heady ideas of inventors into actuality and help them steward that process. So I stopped doing the inventing myself and started supporting those who actually were the inventors that had real things. And like Andrew Murray said, I went directly to the source and just decided to use my skills and my business skills in the past to help support them the best way that I could. And so, for example, how can the community help? Well, yes, there's always need for funding, of course, for research and development. That's part of what my company has done, is help put structures together for these inventors that will secure people putting money in, so they know that there's a path that can be followed. There's also a need for our chemists, our physicists, our mathematicians, to really actually come into this field and start looking at the experimental results, because these are going to have to redefine our laws, our physics laws. When I see and hear about people going and studying physics and getting a PhD, I feel sad for them, because I'm seeing with experimental results things that are defying the quote-unquote laws of physics. I'm seeing those on a daily basis, and so we need to have as many physicists looking at these experiments and rewriting the mathematics to describe what's happening. So we can engineer with this new mathematics and these new physics, because we're going to be engineering new systems based on this. For example, with the Joule box, normally an equation in physics that is well known is a ratio. It's taken about 746 watts to make 1 horsepower of torque. It's a known, and sometimes it takes more than that. Now we can make that same 1 horsepower of torque with 200 watts, and it's through the very efficient management. I call it the Aikido of managing electromagnetics, taking forces and redirecting them specifically with timing. We need physicists to help understand how this is happening, because it's experimental, and so there's many ways that people with skill sets can get involved, not just financially, but with their own communities, for lobbying their communities, their governments, to actually start to support these types of technologies. There's a place for everybody to actually put momentum behind this movement, and the new energy movement, as Andrew mentioned, is a good funnel for people to contact to see where they can help, whether it's financially or otherwise. So.